Chapter 1. If it had not rained on a certain May morning, Valancy Stirling's whole life would have been entirely different. She would have gone, with the rest of her plan, to Aunt Wellington's engagement picnic, and Dr. Trent would have gone to Montreal. But it did rain, and you shall hear what happened to her because of it. Valancy wakened early, in the lifeless, hopeless hour, just preceding dawn. She had not slept very well. One does not sleep well sometimes when one is 29 on the morrow and unmarried, in a community and connection where the unmarried are simply those who have failed to get a man. Dearwood and the Stirlings have long since relegated Valancy to hopeless old maidenhood. But Valancy herself had never quite relinquished a certain pitiful, shamed little hope that romance would come her way yet. Never, until this wet, horrible morning, when she wakened to the fact that she was 29 and unsought by any man. There lay the sting. Valancy did not mind so much being an old maid. After all, she thought, being an old maid couldn't possibly be as dreadful as being married to an Uncle Wellington, or an Uncle Benjamin, or even an Uncle Herbert. What hurt her was that she had never had a chance to be anything but an old maid. No man had ever desired her. The tears came into her eyes as she lay there alone, in the faintly graying darkness. She dared not let herself cry as hard as she wanted to, for two reasons. She was afraid that crying might bring on another attack of that pain around the heart. She had had a spell of it after she had got into bed, rather worse than any she had had yet. And she was afraid her mother would notice her red eyes at breakfast and keep at her with minute, persistent, mosquito-like questions regarding the cause thereof. Suppose that, Valancy with a ghastly grin. I answered with the plain truth. I'm crying because I cannot get married. How horrified mother would be, though she is ashamed every day of her life of her old maid daughter. But of course, appearances should be kept up. It is not. Valancy could hear her mother's prim, dictatorial voice asserting, it is not maidenly to think about men. The thought of her mother's expression made Valancy laugh, for she had a sense of humor nobody in her clan suspected. If for that matter, we can write a good many things about Valancy that nobody suspected. But her laughter was very superficial, and presently she lay there, a huddled, futile little figure, listening to the rain pouring down outside and watching, with a sick distaste, the chill, merciless light creeping into her ugly, sordid room. She knew the ugliness of that room by heart, knew it, and hated it. The yellow-painted floor, with one hideous hooked rug by the bed, with a grotesque hooked dog on it, always grinning at her when she awoke. Her faded, dark red paper. The ceiling discolored by old leaks and crossed by cracks. The narrow, pinched little washstand. The brown paper lambrequin with purple roses on it. The spotted old-looking glass with the crack across it, propped up on the inadequate dressing table. The jar of ancient potpourri made by her mother in her mythical honeymoon. The shell-covered box with one burst quarter, which Cousin Stickles had made in her equally mythical girl. The beaded pincushion with half its bead fringe gone. The one stiff, yeller chair. The faded old motto, gone but not forgotten, worked in colored yarns about great-grandmother Stirling's grim old face, and the old photographs of ancient relatives long banished from the rooms below. There were only two pictures that were not of relatives. One, an old chromo of a puppy sitting on a rainy doorstep. That picture always made Valancy unhappy. That forlorn little dog, crouched on the doorstep in the driving rain. Why didn't someone open the door and let him in? The other picture was a faded passepartout engraving of Queen Louise coming down a stairway, which Aunt Wellington had lavishly given her on her 10th birthday. For 19 years, She had looked at it and hated it. Beautiful, smug, self-satisfied Queen Louise. But she never dared destroy it or remove it. Mother and cousin Stickles would have been aghast, or, as Valancy irreverently expressed it in her thoughts, would have had a fit. Every room in the house was ugly, of course, but downstairs appearances were kept up somewhat. There was no money for rooms. Nobody ever saw. Valancy sometimes felt that she could have done something for her room herself, even without money, if she were permitted. But her mother had negatived every timid suggestion, and Valancy did not persist. Valancy never persisted. She was afraid to. Her mother could not brook opposition. Mrs. Stirling would sulk for days if offended, with the airs of an insulted duchess. The only thing Valancy liked about her room was that she could be alone there at night, to cry if she wanted to. But after all, what did it matter if her room, which you used for nothing except sleeping and dressing it, were ugly? Valancy was never permitted to stay alone in her room for any other purpose. People who wanted to be alone, so Mrs. Frederick Stirling and Cousin Stickles believed, could only want to be alone for some sinister purpose. That her room in the Blue Castle was everything a room should be. Valancy, so cowed and subdued, and overridden and snubbed in real life, was wont to let herself go rather splendidly in her daydream. Nobody in the Stirling clan, or its ramifications, suspected this, least of all her mother and Cousin Stickles. They never knew, but Valancy had two homes: the ugly red brick box of a home on Elm Street and the Blue Castle in Spain. Valancy had lived spiritually in the Blue Castle ever since she could remember. She had been a very tiny child when she found herself possessed of it. Always, when she shut her eyes, she could see it plainly, with its turrets and banners on the pine-clad mountain height, wrapped in its faint blue loveliness against the sunset skies of a fair and unknown land. Everything wonderful and beautiful was in that castle. Jewels that queens might have worn, robes of moonlight and fire, couches of roses and gold, long flights of shallow marble steps with great white urns and with slender, mist-clad maidens going up and down them, courts, marble-pillared, where shimmering fountains fell and nightingales sang among the myrtles, halls of mirrors that reflected only handsome knights and lovely women, herself the loveliest of all, for whose glance men died. All that supported her through the boredom of her days was the hope of going on a dream spree at night. Most, if not all, of the Stirlings would have died of horror if they had known half the things Valancy did in her Blue Castle. For one thing, she had quite a few lovers in it. Oh, only one at a time. One who wooed her with all the romantic ardor of the age of chivalry, and won her after long devotion and many deeds of daring do, and was wedded to her with pomp and circumstance in the great banner-hung chapel of the Blue Castle. At 12, this lover was a fair lad with golden curls and heavenly blue eyes. At 15, he was tall and dark and pale, but still necessarily handsome. At 20, he was ascetic, dreamy. At 25, he had a clean-cut jaw, slightly grim, and a face strong and rugged rather than handsome. Valancy never grew older than 25 in her Blue Castle, but recently, very recently, her hero had had reddish, tawny hair, a twisted smile, and a mysterious past. I don't say Valancy deliberately murdered these lovers as she outgrew them. One simply faded away as another came. Things are very convenient in this respect in Blue Castles. But on this morning of her day of fate, Valancy could not find the key of her Blue Castle. Reality pressed on her too hardly, barking at her heels like a maddening little dog. She was 29, lonely, undesired, ill-favored, the only homely girl in a handsome clan, with no past, and no future. As far as she could look back, life was drab and colorless, with not one single cleansing or purple spot aim. As far as she could look forward, it seemed certain to be just the same of it, until she was nothing but a solitary, little withered leaf clinging to a wintry bough. The moment when a woman realizes that she has nothing to live for, neither love, duty, purpose, nor hope, holds for her the bitterness of death. And I just have to go on living because I can't stop. I may have to live 80 years, thought Valancy, in a kind of panic. We're all horribly long-lived. It sickens me to think of it. She was glad it was raining, or rather, she was drearily satisfied that it was raining. There would be no picnic that day. This annual picnic, whereby Aunt and Uncle Wellington, one always thought of them in that succession, inevitably celebrated an engagement at a picnic 30 years before, had been of late years a veritable nightmare to Valancy. By an impish coincidence, it was the same day as her birthday. And after she had passed 25, nobody let her forget it. Much as she hated going to the picnic, it would never have occurred to her to rebel against it. There seemed to be nothing of the revolutionary in her nature, and she knew exactly what everyone would say to her at the picnic. Uncle Wellington, whom she disliked and despised, even though he had fulfilled the highest Stirling aspiration, marrying money, would say to her in a pig's whisper, "Not thinking of getting married yet, my dear?" And then go off into the bellow of laughter with which he invariably concluded his dull remarks. And Wellington, of whom Valancy stood in abject awe, would tell her about Olive's new chiffon dress and Cecil's last devoted letter. Valancy would have to look as pleased and interested as if the dress and letter had been hers, or else Aunt Wellington would be offended. And Valancy had long ago decided that she would rather offend God than Aunt Wellington, because God might forgive her. But Aunt Wellington never. Aunt Alberta, enormously fat, with an amiable habit of always referring to her husband as if he were the only male creature in the world, who could never forget that she had been a great beauty in her youth, would condole us with Valancy on her sallow skin. I don't know why all the girls of today are so sunburned. When I was a girl, my skin was roses and cream. I was counted the prettiest girl in Canada, my dear. Perhaps Uncle Herbert wouldn't say anything, or perhaps he would remark jocingly, "How fat you're getting, Doss." And then everybody would laugh over the excessively humorous idea of poor, scrawny little Doss getting fat. Handsome, solemn Uncle James, whom Valancy disliked, but respected, because he was reputed to be very clever, and was therefore the clan oracle. Brains being none too plentiful in the Stirling connection, would probably remark with the owl-like sarcasm that had won him his reputation, "I suppose you're busy with your hope chest these days?" And Uncle Benjamin would ask some of his abominable conundrums between wheezy chuckles and answer them himself. What is the difference between Doss and a mouse? The mouse wishes to harm the cheese, and Doss wishes to charm the he's. Valancy had heard him ask that riddle 50 times, and every time she wanted to throw something at him. But she never did. In the first place, the Stirlings simply did not throw things. In the second place, Uncle Benjamin was a wealthy and childless old widower, and Valancy had been brought up in the fear and admonition of his money. If she offended him, he would cut her out of his will. Supposing she were in it, Valancy did not want to be cut out of Uncle Benjamin's will. She had been poor all her life, and knew the galling bitterness of it. So she endured his riddles, and even smiled tortured little smiles over them. Aunt Isabel, downright and disagreeable as an east wind, would criticize her in some way. Valancy could not predict just how, for Aunt Isabel never repeated a criticism. She found something new with which to jab you every time. Aunt Isabel prided herself on saying what she thought, but didn't like it so well when other people said what they thought to her. Valancy never said what she thought. Cousin Georgiana, named after her great-great-grandmother, who had been named after George IV, would recount dolorously the names of all relatives and friends who had died since the last picnic, and wonder which of us will be the first to go next. Oppressively competent, Aunt Mildred would talk endlessly of her husband and her odious prodigies of baby to Valancy because Valancy would be the only one she could find to put up with it. For the same reason, Cousin Gladys, really first Cousin Gladys once removed, according to the strict way in which the Stirlings tabulated relationship. A tall, thin lady who admitted that she had a sensitive disposition would describe minutely the tortures of her neuritis. And Olive, the wonder girl of the whole Stirling clan, who had everything Valancy had not, beauty, popularity, love, would show off her beauty, and presume on her popularity, and flaunt her diamond insignia of love in Valancy's dazzled, envious eyes. There would be none of all this today, and there would be no packing up of teaspoons. The packing up was always left for Valancy and Cousin Stickles. And once, 6 years ago, a silver teaspoon from Aunt Wellington's wedding set had been lost. Valancy never heard the last of that silver teaspoon. Its ghost appeared banquo-like at every subsequent family feast. Oh yes, Valancy knew exactly what the picnic would be like, and she blessed the rain that had saved her from it. There would be no picnic this year. If Aunt Wellington could not celebrate on the sacred day itself, she would have no celebration at all. Thank whatever gods there were for that. Since there would be no picnic, Valancy made up her mind that if the rain held up in the afternoon, she would go up to the library and get another of John Foster's books. Valancy was never allowed to read novels, but John Foster's books were not novels. They were nature books. So the librarian told Mrs. Frederick Stirling all about birds, dogs. So Valancy was allowed to read them under protest, for it was only too evident that she enjoyed them too much. It was permissible, even laudable, to read to improve your mind and your religion, but a book that was enjoyable was dangerous. Valancy did not know whether her mind was being improved or not, but she felt vaguely that if she had come across John Foster's books years ago, life might have been a different thing for her. They seemed to her to yield glimpses of a world into which she might once have entered, though the door was forever barred to her now. It was only within the last year that John Foster's books had been in the Deerwood Library, that the librarian told Valancy that he had been a well-known writer for several years. Where does he live? Valancy had asked. Nobody knows. From his books, he must be a Canadian, but no more information can be had. His publishers won't say a word. Quite likely, John Foster is a nom de plume. His books are so popular, we can't keep them in at all. Though I really can't see what people find in them to rave over. I think they're wonderful, said Valancy. Timidly, said Oh, well, Miss Clarkson smiled in a patronizing fashion that relegated Valancy's opinions to limbo. I can't say I care much for bugs myself, but certainly Foster seems to know all there is to know about them. Valancy didn't know whether she cared much for bugs either. It was not John Foster's uncanny knowledge of wild creatures and insect life that enthralled her. She could hardly say what it was, some tantalizing lure of a mystery never revealed, some hint of a great secret just a little further on, some faint, elusive echo of lovely, forgotten things. John Foster's magic was indefinable. Yes, she would get a new Foster book. It was a month since she had Thistle Harvest, so surely Mother could not object. Valancy had read it 4 times. She knew whole passages off by heart, and she almost thought she would go and see Dr. Trent about that queer pain around the heart. It had come rather often lately, and the palpitations were becoming annoying, not to speak of an occasional dizzy moment and a queer shortness of breath. But could she go to see him without telling anyone? It was a most daring thought. None of the Stirlings ever consulted a doctor without holding a family council and getting Uncle James's approval. Then they went to Dr. Ambrose Marsh of Port Lawrence, who had married second cousin Adelaide Stirling. But Valancy disliked Dr. Ambrose Marsh, and besides, she could not get to Port Lawrence, 15 miles away, without being taken there. She did not want anyone to know about her heart. There would be such a fuss made, and every member of the family would come down and talk it over and advise her and caution her and warn her and tell her horrible tales of great aunts and cousins 40 times removed who had been just like that and dropped dead without a moment's warning. Aunt Isabel would remember that she had always said Doss looked like a girl who would have heart trouble, so pinched and peaked always. And Uncle Wellington were taken as a personal insult when no Stirling ever had heart disease before. And Georgiana would forebode, imperfectly audible, asides that poor, dear little Doss isn't long for this world, I'm afraid. And Cousin Gladys would say, why, my heart has been like that for years, in a tone that implied no one else had any business even to have a heart. And Olive would merely look beautiful and superior, disgustingly healthy, as if to say, why all this fuss over a faded superfluity like Doss when you have me? Valancy felt that she couldn't tell anybody unless she had to. She felt quite sure there was nothing at all seriously wrong with her heart, and no need of all the pother that would ensue if she mentioned it. She would just slip up quietly and see Dr. Trent that very day. As for his bill, she had the $200 that her father had put in the bank for her the day she was born. She was never allowed to use even the interest of this, but she would secretly take out enough to pay Dr. Trent. Dr. Trent was a gruff, outspoken, absent-minded old fellow, but he was a recognized authority on heart disease, even if he were only a general practitioner and out-of-the-world dearwood. Dr. Trent was over 70, and there had been rumors that he meant to retire soon. None of the Stirling clan had ever gone to him since he had told Cousin Gladys, 10 years before, that her neuritis was all imaginary and that she enjoyed it. You couldn't patronize a doctor who insulted your first cousin once removed like that. Not to mention that he was a Presbyterian when all the Stirling to the Anglican Church. But Valancy, between the devil of disloyalty to clan and the deep sea of fuss and clatter and advice, thought she would take a chance with the devil. Chapter 2. When Cousin Stickles knocked at her door, Valancy knew it was 7:30, and she must get up. As long as she could remember, Cousin Stickles had knocked at her door at 7:30. Cousin Stickles and Mrs. Frederick Stirling had been up since 7, but Valancy was allowed to lie abed half an hour longer because of a family tradition that she was delicate. Valancy got up, but she hated getting up more this morning than ever she had before. What was there to get up for? Another dreary day like all the days that had preceded it, full of meaningless little tasks, joyless and unimportant, that benefited nobody. But if she did not get up at once, she would not be ready for breakfast at 8 o'clock. Hard and fast times for meals were the rule in Mrs. Stirling's household. Breakfast at 8, dinner at 1, supper at 6, year in and year out. No excuses for being late were ever tolerated. So up Valancy got, shivering. The room was bitterly cold with the raw, penetrating chill of a wet May morning. The house would be cold all day. It was one of Mrs. Frederick's rules that no fires were necessary after the 24th of May. Meals were cooked on the little oil stove in the back porch, and though May might be icy and October frost-bitten, no fires were lighted until the 21st of October by the calendar. On the 21st of October, Mrs. Frederick began cooking over the kitchen range and lighted a fire in the sitting room stove in the evening. It was whispered about in the connection that the late Frederick Stirling had caught the cold, which resulted in his death during Valancy's first year of life. Because Mrs. Frederick would not have a fire on the 20th of October, she lighted it the next day, but that was a day too late for Frederick Stirling. Valancy took off and hung up in the closet her net dress of coarse, unbleached cotton with high neck and long, tight sleeves. She put on undergarments of a similar make, a dress of brown gingham, thick black stockings, and rubber-heeled boots. Of late years, she had fallen into the habit of doing her hair with the shade of the window by the looking-glass pulled down. The lines on her face did not show so plainly then, but this morning she jerked the shade to the very top and looked at herself in the leprous mirror with a passionate determination to see herself as the world saw her. The result was rather dreadful. Even a beauty would have found that harsh, unsoftened sidelight trying. Valancy saw straight black hair, short and thin, always lusterless, despite the fact that she gave it 100 strokes of the brush, neither more nor less, every night of her life, and faithfully rubbed Redfern's hair vigor into the roots, more lustreless than ever in its morning roughness. Fine, straight, black brows. The nose she had always felt was much too small even for her small, three-cornered white face. A small, pale mouth that always fell open, a trifle over little, pointed, white teeth, a figure thin and flat-breasted, rather below the average height. She had somehow escaped the family high cheekbones, and her dark brown eyes, too soft and shadowy to be black, had a slant that was almost oriental. Apart from her eyes, she was neither pretty nor ugly, just insignificant looking, she concluded bitterly. How plain the lines around her eyes and mouth were in that merciless light, and never had her narrow white face looked so narrow and so white. She did her hair in a pompadour. Pompadours had long gone out of fashion, but they had been in when Valancy first put her hair up, and Aunt Wellington had decided that she must always wear her hair so. It is the only way that becomes you. Your face is so small that you must add height to it by a pompadour effect, said Aunt Wellington, who always enunciated commonplaces as if uttering profound and important truths. Valancy had hankered to do her hair pulled low on her forehead with puffs above the ears, as Olive was wearing hers. But Aunt Wellington's dictum had such an effect on her that she never dared change her style of hairdressing. But then, there were so many things Valancy never dared do. All her life, she had been afraid of something. She thought bitterly, from the very dawn of recollection, when she had been so horribly afraid of the big black bear that lived, so Cousin Stickles told her, in the closet under the stairs. And I always will be. I know it. I can't help it. I don't know what it would be like not to be afraid of something. Afraid of her mother's sulky fits, afraid of offending Uncle Benjamin, afraid of becoming a target for Aunt Wellington's contempt, afraid of Aunt Isabel's biting comments, afraid of Uncle James's disapproval, afraid of offending the whole clan's opinions and prejudices, afraid of not keeping up appearances, afraid to say what she really thought of it, afraid of poverty in her old age. Fear, fear, fear. She could never escape from it. It bound her and enmeshed her like a spider's web of steel. Only in her blue castle could she find temporary release. And this morning, Valancy could not believe she had a blue castle. She would never be able to find it again. 29, unmarried, undesired. What had she to do with the fairy-like chatelaine of the Blue Castle? She would cut such childish nonsense out of her life forever and face reality unflinchingly. She turned from her unfriendly mirror and looked out. The ugliness of the view always struck her like a blow. The ragged fence, the tumble-down old carriage shop in the next lot, plastered with crude, violently colored advertisements. The grimy railway station beyond, with the awful derelicts that were always hanging around it, even at this early hour. In the pouring rain, everything looked worse than usual, especially the beastly advertisement. Keep that schoolgirl complexion. Valancy had kept her schoolgirl complexion. That was just the trouble. There was not a gleam of beauty anywhere. Exactly like my life, thought Valancy, drearily. Her brief bitterness had passed. She accepted facts as resignedly as she had always accepted them. She was one of the people whom life always passes by. There was no altering that fact. In this mood, Valancy went down to breakfast. Chapter 3. Breakfast was always the same. Oatmeal porridge, which Valancy loathed, toast and tea, and 1 teaspoonful of marmalade. Mrs. Frederick thought 2 teaspoonfuls extravagant. But that did not matter to Valancy, who hated marmalade too. The chilly, gloomy little dining room was chillier and gloomier than usual. The rain streamed down outside the window. The parted Stirlings in atrocious gilt frames, wider than the pictures, glowered down from the walls. And yet, Cousin Stickles wished Valancy many happy returns of the day. Sit up straight, Doss, was all her mother said. Valancy sat up, straight. She talked to her mother and Cousin Stickles of the things they always talked of. She never wondered what would happen if she tried to talk of something else. She may. Therefore, she never did it. Mrs. Frederick was offended with Providence for sending a rainy day when she wanted to go to a picnic, so she ate her breakfast in a sulky silence for which Valancy was rather grateful. But Christine Stickles whined endlessly on as usual, complaining about everything: the weather, the leak in the pantry, the price of oatmeal and butter. Valancy felt that once she had buttered her toast too lavishly. The epidemic of mumps in Deerwood. Doss will be sure to catch them, she foreboded. Doss must not go where she is likely to catch mumps, said Mrs. Frederick shortly. Valancy had never had mumps, or whooping cough, or chicken pox, or measles, or anything she should have had. Nothing but horrible colds every winter. Doss's winter colds were a sort of tradition in the family. Nothing, it seemed, could prevent her from catching them. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles did their heroic best. One winter, they kept Valancy housed up from November to May in the warm sitting room. She was not even allowed to go to church, and Valancy took cold after cold and ended up with bronchitis and Jane. None of my family were ever like that, said Mrs. Frederick, implying that it must be a Stirling tendency. The Stirlings seldom take colds, said Cousin Stickles resentfully. She had been a Stirling. I think, said Mrs. Frederick, that if a person makes up her mind not to have colds, she will not have colds. So that was the trouble. It was all Valancy's own fault. But on this particular morning, Valancy's unbearable grievance was that she was called Doss. She had endured it for 29 years, and all at once, she felt she could not endure. Her full name was Valancy Jane. Valancy Jane was rather terrible, but she liked Valancy with its odd outland tang. It was always a wonder to Valancy that the Stirlings had allowed her to be so christened. She had been told that her maternal grandfather, old Amoswansbara, had chosen the name for her. Her father had tacked on the Jane by way of civilizing it, and the whole connection got out of the difficulty by nicknaming her Doss. She never got Valancy from anyone but outsiders. Other, she said timidly, Would you mind calling me Valancy after this? Doss seems so, I don't like it. Mrs. Frederick looked at her daughter in astonishment. She wore glasses with enormously strong lenses that gave her eyes a peculiarly disagreeable appearance. What is the matter with Doss? It seems so childish, faltered Valancy. Oh, Mrs. Frederick had been a Wansborough, and the Wansborough smile was not an asset. I see. Well, it should suit you then. You are childish enough, in all conscience, my dear child. And 29, said the dear child desperately. I wouldn't proclaim it from the housetops if I were you, dear, said Mrs. Frederick. 29. I had been married 9 years when I was 29. I was married at 17, said Cousin Stickles proudly. Valancy looked at them furtively. Mrs. Frederick, except for those terrible glasses and the hooked nose that made her look more like a parrot than a parrot itself could look, was not ill-looking. At 20 she might have been quite pretty. But Cousin Stickles, and yet Christine Stickles had once been desirable in some man's eyes. Finally, what actually mighty no belonged function is all dry. The vision of the hubby siding committer to dry with another place in function, this right to look down on her. And even yet, Cousin Stickles was necessary to Mrs. Frederick. Valancy wondered pitifully what it would be like to be wanted by someone, needed by someone. No one in the whole world needed her, or would miss anything from life if she dropped suddenly out of it. She was a disappointment to her mother. No one loved her. She had never so much as had a girlfriend. I haven't even a gift for friendship, she had once admitted to herself, pitifully. Doss, you haven't eaten your crusts, said Mrs. Frederick rebukingly. It rained all the forenoon, without cessation. Valancy pieced a quilt. Valancy hated piecing quilts, and there was no need of it. The house was full of quilts. There were 3 big chests, packed with quilts, in the attic. Mrs. Frederick had begun storing away quilts when Valancy was 17, and she kept on storing them, though it did not seem likely that Valancy would ever need them. But Valancy must be at work, and fancy work materials were too expensive. Idleness was a cardinal sin in the Stirling household. When Valancy had been a child, she had been made to write down every night in a small, heated black notebook all the minutes she had spent in idleness that day. On Sundays, her mother made her tot them up and pray over them. On this particular forenoon of this day of destiny, Valancy spent only 10 minutes in idleness. At least, Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles would have called it idleness. She went to her room to get a better thimble, and she opened Thistle Harvest guiltily around them. The woods are so humane, wrote John Foster, that to know them, one must live with them. An occasional saunter through them, keeping to the well-trodden paths, will never admit us to their intimacy. If we wish to be friends, we must seek them out and win them by frequent, reverent visits at all hours, by morning, by noon, and by night, and at all seasons, in spring, in summer, in autumn, in winter. Otherwise, we can never really know them, and any pretense we may make to the contrary will never impose on them. They have their own effective way of keeping Arians at a distance and shutting their hearts to mere casual sightseers. It is of no use to seek the woods from any motive except sheer love of them. They'll find us out at once and hide all their sweet old-world secrets from us. But if they know we come to them because we love them, they will be very kind to us and give us such treasures of beauty and delight as are not bought or sold in any marketplace. For the woods, when they give it all, give unstintedly and hold nothing back from their true worshippers. We must go to them lovingly, humbly, patiently, watchfully, and we shall learn what poignant loveliness lurks in the wild places and silent intervals, lying under starshine and sunset. What cadences of unearthly music are harped on aged pine boughs, or crooned in copses of fir? What delicate savors exhale from mosses and ferns in sunny corners or on damp brooklands? What dreams and myths and legends of an older time haunt them? Then, the immortal heart of the woods will beat against ours, and its subtle life will steal into our veins and make us its own forever. So that no matter where we go, or how widely we wander, we shall yet be drawn back to the forest to find our most enduring kinship.
Doss called her mother from the hall below. What are you doing all by yourself in that room?
Valancy dropped thistle harvests like a hot coal and fled downstairs to her patches. But she felt the strange exhilaration of spirit that always came momentarily to her when she dipped into one of John Foster's books. Valancy did not know much about woods, except the haunted groves of oak and pine around her blue castle, but she had always secretly hankered after them, and a Foster book about woods was the next best thing to the woods themselves. Well, at noon it stopped raining, but the sun did not come out until 3. Then Valancy timidly said she thought she would go uptown. What do you want to go uptown for? Demanded her mother. I want to get a book from the library. You got a book from the library only last week? No, it was 4 weeks. 4 weeks. Nonsense. Really it was, Mother. You are mistaken. It cannot possibly have been more than 2 weeks. I dislike contradiction, and I do not see what you want to get a book for. Anyhow, you waste too much time reading. Of what value is my time? Asked Valancy bitterly. Doss, don't speak in that tone to me. We need some tea, said Cousin Stickles. She might go and get that if she wants a walk, though this damp weather is bad for colds. They argued the matter for 10 minutes longer, and finally, Mrs. Frederick agreed rather grudgingly that Valancy might go. Chapter 4. Got your rubbers on? Called Cousin Stickles as Valancy left the house. Christine Stickles had never once forgotten to ask that question when Valancy went out on a damp day. Yes. Have you got your flannel petticoat on? Asked Mrs. Frederick. No. Doss, I really do not understand you. Do you want to catch your death of cold again? Her voice implied that Valancy had died of a cold several times already. Go upstairs this minute and put it on. Mother, I don't need a flannel petticoat. My sateen one is warm enough. Doss, remember you had bronchitis 2 years ago. Go and do as you're told. Valancy went, though nobody will ever know just how near she came to hurling the rubber clamp into the street before she went. She hated that gray flannel petticoat more than any other garment she owned. Olive never had to wear flannel petticoats. Olive wore ruffled silk and sheer lawn and filmy laced flounces. But Olive's father had married money, and Olive never had bronchitis. So there you were. Are you sure you didn't leave the soap in the water? Demanded Mrs. Frederick. But Valancy was gone. She turned at the corner and looked back down the ugly, prim, respectable street where she lived. The Stirling house was the ugliest on it, more like a red brick box than anything else. Too high for its breadth, and made still higher by a bulbous glass cupola on top. About it was the desolate, barren peace of an old house whose life was lived. There was a very pretty little house with leaded casements and dubbed gables. Just around the corner, a new house. One of those houses you love the minute you see them. Clayton Markley had built it for his bride. He was to be married to Jenny Lloyd in June. The little house, it was said, was furnished from attic to cellar, in complete readiness for its mistress. I don't envy Jenny the man, thought Valancy, sincerely, Clayton Markley was not one of her many ideals, but I do envy her the house. It's such a nice young house. Oh, if I could only have a house of my own, ever so poor, so tiny, but my own. But then, she added bitterly, there is no use in yowling for the moon when you can't even get a telecannon. In dreamland, nothing would do Valancy but a castle of pale sapphire. In real life, she would have been fully satisfied with a little house of her own. She envied Jenny Lloyd more fiercely than ever today. Jenny was not so much better looking than she was, and not so very much younger. Yet she was to have this delightful house. And the nicest little Wedgwood teacups, Valancy had seen them, an open fireplace and monogrammed linen, hem-stitched tablecloths, and china closets. Why did everything come to some girls and nothing to others? It wasn't fair. Valancy was once more seething with rebellion as she walked along. A prim, dowdy little figure in her shabby raincoat and 3-year-old hat, splashed occasionally by the mud of a passing motor with its insulting Motors were still rather a novelty in Deerwood, though they were common in Port Lawrence, and most of the summer residents up at Muskoka had them. In Deerwood, only some of the smart set had them, for even Deerwood was divided into sets. There was the smart set, the intellectual set, the old family set, of which the Stirlings were members, the common run, and a few pariahs. Not one of the Stirling clan had as yet condescended to a motor, though Olive was teasing her father to have one. Valancy had never even been in a motor car, but she did not hanker after this. In truth, she felt rather afraid of motor cars, especially at night. Motor cars, they seemed to be too much like big purring beasts that might turn and crush you, or make some terrible savage leap somewhere. On the steep mountain trails around her blue castle, only gaily capricing steeds might have proudly pace. In real life, Valancy would have been quite contented to drive in a buggy behind a nice horse. She got a buggy drive only when some uncle or cousin remembered to fling her a chance, like a bone to a dog. Chapter 5. Of course she must buy the tea in Uncle Benjamin's grocery store. To buy it anywhere else was unthinkable. Yet Valancy hated to go to Uncle Benjamin's store on her 29th birthday. There is no hope that he would not remember it. Why? Demanded Uncle Benjamin, wearingly, as he tied up her tea. Are young ladies like bad grammarians? Valancy, with Uncle Benjamin's will in the background of her mind, said meekly, Why? Because, chuckled Uncle Benjamin, they can't decline matrimony. The two clerks, Joe Hammond and Claude Bertram, chuckled also, and Valancy disliked them a little more than ever. On the first day Claude Bertram had seen her in the store, she had heard him whisper to Joe, Who is that? And Joe had said, Valancy Stirling, one of the Deerwood old maids, curable or incurable. Claude had asked with a snicker, evidently thinking the question very clever. Valancy smarted anew with the sting of that old recollection. 29, Uncle Benjamin was saying. Dear me, Doss, you're dangerously near the second corner, and not even thinking of getting married yet. 29. It seems impossible. Then Uncle Benjamin said an original thing. Uncle Benjamin said, How time does fly. I think it crawls, said Valancy passionately. Passion was so alien to Uncle Benjamin's conception of Valancy that he didn't know what to make of her. To cover his confusion, he asked another conundrum as he tied up her beans. Cousin Stickles had remembered at the last moment that they must have beans. Beans were cheap and filling. What two ages are apt to prove illusory? Asked Uncle Benjamin. And not waiting for Valancy to give it up, he added, mere auge and marriage. Mirage is pronounced mirage, said Valancy shortly. Picking up her tea, and her beans. For the moment, she did not care whether Uncle Benjamin cut her out of his will or not. She walked out of the store while Uncle Benjamin stared after her with his mouth open. Then he shook his head. "Poor Doss is taking it hard," he said. Valancy was sorry by the time she reached the next crossing. Why had she lost her patience like that? Uncle Benjamin would be annoyed and would likely tell her mother that Doss had been impertinent to me, and her mother would lecture her for a week. "I've held my tongue for 20 years, thought Valancy. Why couldn't I have held it once more? Yes, it was just 20, Valancy reflected, since she had first been twitted with her loverless condition. She remembered the bitter moment perfectly. She was just 9 years old, and she was standing alone on the school playground while the other little girls of her class were playing a game in which you must be chosen by a boy as his partner before you could play. Nobody had chosen Valancy, little pale black-haired Valancy with her prim, long-sleeved apron and odd slanted eyes. "Oh," said a pretty little girl to her, "I'm so sorry for you. You haven't got a beau." Valancy had said defiantly, as she continued to say for 20 years, "I don't want a bow." But this afternoon, Valancy, once and for all, stopped saying that. "I want to be honest with myself anyhow," she thought, savagely. "Uncle Benjamin's riddles hurt me because they are true. I do want to be married. I want a house of my own. I want a husband of my own. I want sweet little fat babies of my own." Valancy stopped suddenly aghast at her own recklessness. She felt sure that Reverend Dr. Stirling, who passed her at this moment, read her thoughts and disapproved of them thoroughly. Valancy was afraid of Dr. Stirling, had been afraid of him ever since the Sunday, 23 years before, when he had first come to St. Albans. Valancy had been too late for Sunday school that day, and she had gone into the church and sat in it. No one else was in the church. Nobody except the new rector, Dr. Stirling. Dr. Help was the any. Stirling stood up in front of the choir door, beckoned to her, and said sternly, "Little boy, come up here." Valancy had stared around her. There was no little boy. There was no one in all the huge church but herself. This strange man with the blue glasses couldn't mean her. She was not a boy. "Little boy," repeated Dr. Stirling, more sternly still, shaking his forefinger fiercely at her. "Come up here at once." Valancy arose, as if hypnotized, and walked up the aisle. She was too terrified to do anything else. What dreadful thing was going to happen to her? What had happened to her? Had she actually turned into a boy? She came to a stop in front of Dr. Stirling. Stirling shook his forefinger, such a long, knuckly forefinger, at her, and said, "Little boy, take off your hat." Valancy took off her hat. She had a scrawny little pigtail hanging down her back, but Dr. Stirling was short-sighted and did not perceive it. "Little boy, go back to your seat, and all this take off your hat in church. Remember, when Valancy went back to her seat, carrying her hat like an automaton. Presently, her mother came in. "Doss," said Mrs. Stirling, "what do you mean by taking off your hat?" "Put it on, instantly." Valancy put it on, instantly. She was cold with fear lest Dr. Perduen, their daughter, Stirling should immediately summon her up front again. She would have to go, of course. It never occurred to her that one could disobey the rector. And the church was full of people now. Oh, what would she do if that horrible stabbing forefinger were shaken at her again before all those people? Valancy sat through the whole service in an agony of dread and was sick for a week afterwards. Nobody knew why. Mrs. Frederick again bemoaned herself of her delicate child, Dr. Grapeline. Stirling found out his mistake and laughed over it to Valancy, who did not laugh. She never got over her dread of Dr. Stirling, and now to be caught by him on the street corner, thinking such things. Valancy got her John Foster book, Magic of Wings. His latest all about birds, said Miss Clarkson. She had almost decided that she would go home instead of going to see Dr. Trent. Her courage had failed her. She was afraid of offending Uncle James, afraid of angering her mother, afraid of facing gruff, shaggy-browed old Dr. Trent, who would probably tell her, as he had told Cousin Gladys, that her trouble was entirely imaginary, and that she only had it because she liked to have it. No, she would not go. She would get a bottle of Redfern's purple pills instead. Redfern's purple pills were the standard medicine of the Stirling clan. Had they not cured second Cousin Geraldine when 5 doctors have given her up? Valancy always felt very skeptical concerning the virtues of the purple pills. But there might be something in them, and it was easier to take them than to face Dr. Trent alone. She would glance over the magazines in the reading room a few minutes, and then go home. Valancy tried to read a story, but it made her furious. On every page was a picture of the heroine, surrounded by adoring men, and here was she, Valancy Stirling, who could not get a solitary beau. Valancy slammed the magazine shut. She opened Magic of Wings. Her eyes fell on the paragraph that changed her life. Fear is the original sin, wrote John Foster. Almost all the evil in the world has its origin in the fact that someone is afraid of something. It is a cold, slimy serpent coiling about you. It is horrible to live with fear, and it is of all things degrading. Valancy shut Magic of Wings and stood up. She would go and see Dr. Trent. Chapter 6. The ordeal was not so dreadful, after all. Dr. Trent was as gruff and abrupt as usual, but he did not tell her ailment was imaginary. After he had listened to her symptoms and asked a few questions and made a quick examination, he sat for a moment looking at her quite intently. Valancy thought he looked as if he were sorry for her. She caught her breath for a moment. Was the trouble serious? Oh, it couldn't be. Surely. It really hadn't bothered her much. Only lately had got a little worse. Dr. Trent opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the telephone at his elbow rang sharply. He picked up the receiver. Valancy, watching him, saw his face change suddenly as he listened. Hello? Yes. Yes. What? Yes. Yes. A brief interval. My God. Dr. Trent dropped the receiver, dashed out of the room and upstairs without even a glance at Valancy. She heard him rushing madly about overhead, barking out a few remarks to somebody, presumably his housekeeper. Then he came tearing downstairs with a club bag in his hand, snatched his hat and coat from the rack, jerked open the street door, and rushed down the street in the direction of the station. Valancy sat alone in the little office, feeling more absolutely foolish than she had ever felt before in her life. Foolish and humiliated. So this was all that had come of her heroic determination to live up to John Foster and cast fear aside. Not only was she a failure as a relative and non-existent as a sweetheart or friend, but she was not even of any importance as a patient. Dr. Trent had forgotten her very presence in his excitement over whatever message had come by the telephone. She had gained nothing by ignoring Uncle James and flying in the face of family tradition. For a moment she was afraid she was going to cry. It was all so ridiculous. These researches controlled by partner age. Then she heard Dr. Trent's housekeeper coming down the stairs. Valancy rose and went to the office door. The doctor forgot all about me, she said with a twisted smile. Well, that's too bad, said Miss Patterson sympathetically, but it wasn't much wonder, poor man. That was a telegram they phoned over from the port. His son has been terribly injured, in an auto accident in Montreal. The doctor had just 10 minutes to catch the train. I don't know what he'll do if anything happens to Ned. He's just bound up in the boy. We'll have to come again, Miss Stirling. I hope it's nothing serious. Oh, no. Nothing serious, agreed Valancy. She felt a little less humiliated. It was no wonder. Poor Dr. Trent had forgotten her at such a moment. Nevertheless, she felt very flat and discouraged as she went down the street. Valancy went home by the short cut of Lover's Lane. She did not often go through Lover's Lane, but it was getting near supper time, and it would never do to be late. Lover's Lane wound back of the village under great elms and maples and deserved it. It was hard to go there at any time and not find some canoodling couple, or young girls in pairs, arms intertwined, earnestly talking over their little secrets. Valancy didn't know which made her feel more self-conscious and uncomfortable. This evening, she encountered both. She met Connie Hale and Kay Bailey in new pink organdy dresses, with flowers stuck coquettishly in their glossy bare hair. Valancy had never had a pink dress or worn flowers in her hair. Then she passed a young couple she didn't know, dandering along, oblivious to everything but themselves. The young man's arm was around the girl's waist quite shamelessly. Valancy had never walked with a man's arm about her. She felt that she ought to be shocked. They might leave that sort of thing for the screening twilight, at least. But she wasn't shocked. In another flash of desperate, stark honesty, she owned to herself that she was merely envious. When she passed them, she felt quite sure they were laughing at her, pitying her. There's that clear little old maid, Valancy Stirling. They say she never had a beau in her whole life. Valancy fairly ran to get out of Lover's Lane. Never had she felt so utterly colorless and skinny and insignificant. Just where Lover's Lane debouched on the street, an old car was parked. Valancy knew that car well, by sound at least, and everybody in Deerwood knew it. This was before the phrase Tin Lizzie had come into circulation, in Deerwood at least. But if it had been known, this car was the tinniest of Lizzies, though it was not a Ford, but an old gray Slauson. Nothing more battered and disreputable could be imagined. It was Barney Snave's car, and Barney himself was just scrambling out from under it, in overalls plastered with mud. Later, Valancy gave him a swift, furtive look as she hurried by. This was only the second time she had ever seen the notorious Barney Sness, though she had heard enough about him in the 5 years that he had been living up back in Muskoka. The first time had been nearly a year ago, on the Muskoka Road. He had been crawling out from under his carbine, too, and he had given her a cheerful grin as she went by, a little whimsical grin that gave him the look of an amused gnome. He didn't look bad. She didn't believe he was bad, in spite of the wild yarns that were always being told Chris. And of course he went tearing in that terrible old gray Slauson through Deerwood, at hours when all decent people were in bed, often with old Roaring Abel, who made the night hideous with his howls, both of them dead drunk, my dear. And everyone knew that he was an escaped convict and a defaulting bank clerk and a murderer in hiding and an infidel and an illegitimate son of old Roaring Abel Gay and the father of Roaring Abel's illegitimate grandchild and a counterfeiter and a forger and a few other awful things. But still, Valancy didn't believe he was bad. Nobody with a smile like that could be bad, no matter what he had done. It was that night the Prince of the Blue Castle changed from a being of grim jaw and hair with a dash of premature gray to a rakish individual with overlong tawny hair, dashed with red dark brown eyes and ears that stuck out just enough to give him an alert look, but not enough to be called flying jibs. But he still retained something a little grim about the jaw. Barney Snaith looked even more disreputable than usual just now. It was very evident that he hadn't shaved for days, and his hands and arms, bare to the shoulders, were black with grease. But he was whistling gleefully to himself. He seemed so happy, but Valancy envied him. She envied him his lightheartedness, and his irresponsibility, and his mysterious little cabin up on an island in Reykjanes, even his rackety old gray Slauson. Neither he nor his car had to be respectable and live up to traditions. When he rattled past her a few minutes later, bareheaded, leaning back in his Lizzie at a raffish angle, his longish hair blowing in a villainous-looking old black pipe in his mouth, she envied him again. Men had the best of it, no doubt about that. This outlaw was happy, whatever he was or wasn't. She, Valancy Stirling, respectable, well-behaved to the last degree, was unhappy and had always been unhappy. So there you were. Valancy was just in time for supper. The sun had clouded over and a dismal, drizzling rain was falling again. Cousin Stickles had neuralgia. Valancy had to do the family darning, and there was no time for magic of wings. Can't the darning wait till tomorrow? She pleaded. Tomorrow will bring its own duties, said Mrs. Frederick inexorably. Valancy darned all the evening and listened to Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles talking the eternal niggling gossip of the clan as they knitted drearily at interminable black stockings. They discussed second cousin Lillian's approaching wedding in all its bearings. On the whole, they approved. Second cousin Lillian was doing well for herself. Though she hasn't hurried, said Cousin Stickles. She must be 25. There have not fortunately been many old maids in our connection, said Mrs. Frederick bitterly. Valancy flinched. She had run the darning needle into her finger. Third cousin Aaron Gray had been scratched by a cat and had blood poisoning in his finger. Cats are most dangerous animals, said Mrs. Frederick. I would never have a cat about the house. She glared significantly at Valancy through her terrible glasses. Once, 5 years ago, Valancy had asked if she might have a cat. She had never referred to it since, but Mrs. Frederick still suspected her of harboring the unlawful desire in her heart of hearts. Once Valancy sneezed. Now, in the Stirling Code, it was very bad form to sneeze in public. You can always repress a sneeze by pressing your finger on your upper lip, said Mrs. Frederick, rebuking. 9:30 o'clock, and so, as Mr. Peepies would say, to bed. But First Cousin Stickles' neuralgic back must be rubbed with Redfern's liniment. Valancy did that? Valancy always had to do it. She hated the smell of Redfern's liniment. She hated the smug, beaming, portly, bewhiskered, bespectacled picture of Dr. Redfern on the bottle. Her fingers smelled at the horrible stuff after she got into bed, in spite of all the scrubbing she gave them. Valancy's day of destiny had come and gone. She ended it as she had begun it, in tears. Chapter 7. There was a rose bush on the little Stirling lawn growing beside the gate. It was called Doss's rose bush. Cousin Georgiana had given it to Valancy 5 years ago, and Valancy had planted it joyfully. She loved roses. But of course, the rose bush never bloomed. That was her luck. Valancy did many times in the clan did not begin until rose bush, like I'm made to marry Monday. We were absolutely popping, like the miracle Christ did. It throve and grew luxuriantly, with great leafy branches untouched of rust or spider. But not even a bud had ever appeared on it. Valancy, looking at it 2 days after her birthday, was filled with a sudden, overwhelming hatred for it. The thing wouldn't bloom. Very well then, she would cut it down. She marched to the tool room and the barn for her garden life, and she went at the rosebush viciously. A few minutes later, horrified Mrs. Frederick came out to the veranda and beheld her daughter, slashing insanely among the rosebush boughs. Half of them were already strewn on the walk. The bush looked sadly dismantled. "Doss, what on earth are you doing? Have you gone crazy?" "No," said Valancy. She meant to say it defiantly, but habit was too strong for her. She said it deprecatingly. I just made up my mind to cut this bush down. It is no good. It never blooms. Never will bloom." "That is no reason for destroying it," said Mrs. Frederick sternly. "It was a beautiful bush, and quite ornamental. You have made a sorry-looking thing of it." "Rose trees should bloom," said Valancy a little obstinately. "Don't argue with me, Doss. Clear up that mess, and leave the bush alone. I don't know what Georgiana will say when she sees how you have hacked it to pieces. Really, I'm surprised at you. And to do it without consulting me." "The bush is mine," muttered Valancy. "What's that?" "What did you say, Doss?" "I only said the bush was mine," repeated Valancy humbly. Mrs. Frederick turned without a word and marched back into the house. The mischief was done now. Valancy knew she had offended her mother deeply, would not be spoken to or noticed in any way for 2 or 3 days. Cousin Stickles would see to Valancy's bringing up, but Mrs. Frederick would preserve the stony silence of outraged majesty. Valancy sighed and put away her garden knife, hanging it precisely on its precise nail in a tool shop. She cleared away the severed branches and swept up the leaves. Her lips twitched as she looked at the straggling bush. It had an odd resemblance to its shaken, scrawny donor, little cousin Georgiana herself. "I certainly have made an awful-looking thing of it," thought Valancy. But she did not feel repentant, only sorry she had offended her mother. Things would be so uncomfortable until she was forgiven. Mrs. Frederick was one of those women who can make their anger felt all over a house. "Walls and doors are no protection. You better go uptown and get the mail," said Cousin Stickles when Valancy went in. "I can't go. I feel all sorter peaky and piney this spring. I want you to stop at the drugstore and get me a bottle of Redfern's Blend Bitters. There's nothing like Redfern's Bitters for building a body up. Cousin James says the purple pills are the best, but I know better. My poor dear husband took Redfern's Bitters right up to the day he died. Don't let them charge you more than 90 cents. I can get it for that at the port." "And what have you been saying to your poor mother?" "You ever stop to think, Doss, that you can only have one mother? One is enough for me," said Valancy undutifully as she went uptown. She got Cousin Stickles' bottle of bitters, and then she went to the post office and asked for her mail at the general delivery. Her mother did not have a box. It got too little mail to bother with it. Valancy did not expect any mail except the Christian Times, which was the only paper they took. They hardly ever got any letters. But Valancy rather liked to stand in the office and watch Mr. Caraway, the gray-bearded, Santa Clausy old clerk, handing out letters to the lucky people who did get them. He did it with such a detached, impersonal, Jove-like air, as if it did not matter in the least what supernal joys or shuddering horrors might be in those letters for people to whom they were addressed. Letters had a fascination for Valancy, perhaps because she so seldom got any. In her Blue Castle exciting epistles, bound with silk and sealed with crimson, were always being brought to her by pages in livery of gold and blue. But in real life, her only letters were occasional, perfunctory notes from relatives or an advertising circular. Consequently, she was immensely surprised when Mr. Caraway, looking even more Jovian than usual, poked a letter out to her. Yes, it was addressed to her plainly in a fierce, black hand. Miss Valancy Stirling, Elm Street, Deerwood, and the postmark was Montreal. Valancy picked it up with a little quickening of her breath. Montreal! It must be from Dr. Trent. He had remembered her, after all. Valancy met Uncle Benjamin coming in as she was going out and was glad that the letter was safely in her bag. "What," said Uncle Benjamin, "is the difference between a donkey and a postage stamp?" "I don't know." "What?" answered Valancy dutifully. "One you lick with a stick, and the other you stick with a lick?" Uncle Benjamin passed in, tremendously pleased with himself. Cousin Stickles pounced on the Times when Valancy got home, but it did not occur to her to ask if there were any letters. Mrs. Frederick would have asked it, but Mrs. Frederick's lips at present were sealed. Valancy was glad of this. If her mother had asked if there were any letters, Valancy would have had to admit there was. Then she would have had to let her mother and Cousin Stickles read the letter, and all would be discovered. Her heart acted strangely on the way upstairs, and she sat down by her window for a few minutes before opening her letter. She felt very guilty and deceitful. She had never before kept a letter secret from her mother. Every letter she had ever written or received had been read by Mrs. Frederick. That had never mattered. Valancy had never had anything to hide. But this did matter. She could not have anyone see this letter, but her fingers trembled with the consciousness of wickedness and unfilial conduct as she opened it. Trembled a little, too, perhaps with apprehension. She felt quite sure there was nothing seriously wrong with her heart, but one never knew. Dr. Trent's letter was like himself, blunt, abrupt, concise, wasting no words. Dr. Trent never beat about the bush. "Dear Miss Stirling," and then a page of black, positive writing. Valancy seemed to read it at a glance. She dropped it on her lap, her face ghost white. Dr. Trent told her that she had a very dangerous and fatal form of heart disease, angina pectoris, evidently complicated with an aneurysm. Whatever that was, and in the last stages. He said, without mincing matters, that nothing could be done for her. If she took great care of herself, that she might also die at any moment. Dr. Trent never troubled himself about euphemisms. She must be careful to avoid all excitement and all severe muscular efforts. She must eat and drink moderately. She must never run. She must go upstairs and uphill with great care. Any sudden jolt or shock might be fatal. She was to get the prescription he enclosed, filled, and carry it with her always, taking a dose whenever her attacks came on. And he was hers truly, H.B. Trent. Valancy sat for a long while by her window. Outside was a world, drowned in the light of a spring afternoon. Skies entrancingly blue, winds perfumed and free, lovely, soft, blue hazes at the end of every street. Over at the railway station, a group of young girls was waiting for a train. She heard their gay laughter as they chattered and joked. The train roared in and roared out again, but none of these things had any reality. Nothing had any reality except the fact that she had only another year to live. When she was tired of sitting at the window, she went over and lay down on her bed, staring at the cracked, discolored ceiling. The curious numbness that follows on a staggering blow possessed her. She did not feel anything except a boundless surprise and incredulity, behind which was the conviction that Dr. Trent knew his business and that she, Valancy Stirling, who had never lived, was about to die. When the gong rang for supper, Valancy got up and went downstairs mechanically, from force of habit. She wondered that she had been let alone so long, but of course her mother would not pay any attention to her just now. Valancy was thankful for this. She thought the quarrel over the rosebush had been really, as Mrs. Frederick herself may have said, providential. She could not eat anything, but both Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles thought this was because she was deservedly unhappy over her mother's attitude, and her lack of appetite was not commented on. Valancy forced herself to swallow a cup of tea and then sat and watched the others eat, with an odd feeling that years had passed since she had sat with them at the dinner table. She found herself smiling inwardly to think what a commotion she could make if she chose. Let her merely tell them what was in Dr. Trent's letter, and there would be as much fuss made as if Valancy thought bitterly. They really cared two straws about her. Regardless of the facing siding of skills, the kid would jumps again everybody before, or Boggs, Dr. Trent's. Was there anything in thought waves? Mrs. Judd was talking to Habitat. They think his son will recover, but Dr. Trent wrote that if he did, he was going to take him abroad as soon as he was able to travel, and wouldn't be back here for a year, at least. That will not matter much to us, said Mrs. Frederick majestically. He is not our doctor. I would not. Here she looked, or seemed to look, accusingly right through Valancy. Have him to doctor a sick cat. May I go upstairs and lie down? Said Valancy faintly. I have a headache. What has given you a headache? Asked Cousin Stickles, since Mrs. Frederick would not. The question had to be asked. Valancy could not be allowed to have headaches without interference. You ain't in the habit of having headaches. I hope you're not taking the mumps. Here, try a spoonful of vinegar. Piffle, said Valancy rudely, getting up from the table. She did not care just then if she were rude. She had had to be so polite all her life. If it had been possible for Cousin Stickles to turn pale, she would have. As it was not, she turned yellower. You sure you ain't feverish, Doss? You sound like it. You go and get right into bed, said Cousin Stickles, thoroughly alarmed, and I'll come up and rub your forehead and the back of your neck with Redfern's liniment. Valancy had reached the door, but she turned. I won't be rubbed with Redfern's liniment, she said. Cousin Stickles stared and gasped. What? What do you mean? I said I wouldn't be rubbed with Redfern's liniment, repeated Valancy. Horrid, sticky stuff, and it has the vilest smell of any liniment I ever saw. It's no good. I want to be left alone. That's all. Valancy went out, leaving Cousin Stickles aghast. She's feverish. She must be feverish, ejaculated Cousin Stickles. Mrs. Frederick went on eating her supper. It did not matter whether Valancy was or was not feverish. Valancy had been guilty of impertinence to her,